Welcome everyone to the MYP Interdisciplinary Teaching and Learning Revised Guide Overview. And today we are going to look at the new MYP Interdisciplinary Guide. Basically, what's the same? What are the key changes? The things that are different, the things that have been totally changed, the things that have been clarified or added or deleted. And then hopefully we'll have time for a bit of a Q&A. So what is the same in the new guide? When we get to the end of the hour, as I said, you might not think this, but almost everything is the same. The purpose of IDUs, the planning, the structure of interdisciplinary teaching and learning, all of those are the same. There's the same emphasis on making interdisciplinary connections across the curriculum, and that means making links between the single subject units, links between the concepts, the context, and the content. And based on the discussions that I am aware of, this is actually going to be more and more the direction that IB goes in, making those interdisciplinary connections very strong between the single subject units. There's the same formal IDU requirements, and this is a little bit confusing in the guide. And as I said in one of my emails, the guide is going to have a few updates prior to the first teaching in August. So this is one of the things that will be clarified. There's still the minimum of one formal IDU per MYP year level. And the exception is for candidate schools. So if the verification visit is in the second year of MYP implementation, there's only one IDU that needs to have been implemented, and they need another IDU in the planning stages in development. If the verification visit is in the third year of MYP implementation, the school needs to have two IDUs taught and another IDU in development. There is the same necessity for substantive disciplinary grounding during an IDU. So even though criterion A is different and it no longer assesses disciplinary grounding, you still need to learn disciplinary content in the new criterion. Students will need to analyze that learning. So we'll get into the specifics of the changes in assessment in a bit, but know that disciplinary grounding, distinct disciplinary learning, is still a part of an IDU, just like it was before, but that continues, even though that's not assessed in that way. So it's the same interdisciplinary unit planning process. And for those of you who already heard me say this, but if you need a refresher, you can refer to the previous IBMA Zoom session that we had on interdisciplinary unit planning. It still applies, again, except for the assessment part in the example unit plan that was shared. It's the same evaluating MYP interdisciplinary unit plans guide, although I'm thinking as I was looking through it again more closely, that might get a tiny bit of updating as well so that it fully aligns with the guidance in the new guide. And it's just currently, it's the same BQC process that aligns with that publication. Okay, so much is the same, but there are some very important changes and we'll go over those. Generally, we'll go into each of these in more detail, but generally there are 4 key differences. 3 of them might or might not impact your units, and 1 of them definitely will. So the first 3. First one, interdisciplinary units can be developed between disciplines within the same subject group. Second one, the time used for disciplinary learning during an IDU can count towards total subject group hours. Concurrent IDU teaching and learning is strongly encouraged, but non-concurrent IDUs are allowed if your schedule necessitates that. We'll be getting into what all those things are in just a minute, but those are the 3 that might or might not impact your interdisciplinary units. The 4th one definitely will. The objectives and the criteria are different. So let's take a deeper look at each of those changes and also a few other areas that have been clarified or added or deleted. So the first one, interdisciplinary units can now be developed between disciplines within the same subject group. So whereas now, currently, the current requirement is that formal IDUs need to involve 2 or more subject groups. For instance, individuals and societies and language and literature. But next year, formal IDUs can also be developed that involve 2 or more disciplines within the same subject group. For instance, in the arts, an IDU can involve visual arts and drama. So assuming, and this is a big assumption because I don't know many schools where students can enroll in multiple disciplines of art, for example, in the same trimester or year. But assuming that the same students are enrolled in the participating disciplines, for instance, visual arts and drama, this change might allow for some really interesting considerations of the nuanced differences in disciplinary perspectives regarding those shared concepts. For example, in this slide, the students might gain a more holistic understanding of communication, creativity, and innovation by comparing and contrasting how visual arts and drama interpret these concepts and the relationships between them. Or students might gain a more holistic understanding of systems, interaction, and consequences by comparing and contrasting how chemistry and biology interpret these concepts and the relationship between them. Another starting point might be to consider how the knowledge and skills from different disciplines might be integrated to address a specific global problem, for example, water pollution. And these disciplinary combinations might generate not only new understanding, but also new types of action outcomes, which we'll go into, which is a new part of, well, it's not new, but it's emphasized now in the new guide, the action outcome, the product. Okay, next change that might or might not affect you. During an IDU, the hours used for disciplinary learning can officially count towards the total subject group hours. This could be important for any courses that might be having difficulty meeting the minimum 50 hours and therefore might be hesitant to participate in an IDU. So what does that mean? So let's say that this is the basic organization of a 20-hour IDU. Remember that 20 hours is just an example. There's no set requirement in hours for an IDU, and actually in my experience, I think that 20 hours might be on the low side. But let's just use this in this example as a nice round number. In this example, let's say that the 2 subjects being integrated are sciences and mathematics. During the unit, there might be a 2-hour integrated introduction to the unit, perhaps with the students from both classes combined in an open block period, or with 1 hour each in separate class periods. Then there might be 10 hours total of disciplinary learning, 5 hours in each course. And then possibly 8 hours of integrated learning and summative task development. So which parts of this unit timeframe can be counted for each subject? Clearly, the time spent specifically on learning disciplinary content during the disciplinary learning processes. So in this example, each subject could count 5 hours. Also can be counted is any time spent on distinct disciplinary content during the integrated parts of the unit. In this example, perhaps half an hour is spent on distinct aspects of each subject's content during the introduction. And then half an hour during the integrated learning process or during the development of the integrated summative task. Or it might be that just one of the subjects uses the integrated time to clarify specific unit content. In this example, it might be that an hour is needed to clarify instruction regarding the mathematics involved in the integrated task. So again, mathematics could count an hour from that. So, but clearly, These smaller timeframes might be inexact. You don't have to take a minute-by-minute accounting of your interdisciplinary unit. Presumably, fulfilling the minimum total hours of 50 for a subject group instruction would not rely on such a precise minute-by-minute count. But in some schools, depending on their timetable, counting these time increments in, say, design, arts, or PhD might really make a difference and allow those subjects to participate. Another change is that while concurrent interdisciplinary learning and teaching is strongly encouraged, non-concurrent interdisciplinary units are also allowed. So let's look at that more closely. What does that mean? A concurrently taught IDU is when the participating subjects use the same time frame during the year for the interdisciplinary unit. As we just looked at, both subjects possibly allot class time to have an introduction to the IDU. There might be a hook or an anticipatory set experience to get the students engaged, maybe an orientation to the purpose of the unit, the statement of inquiry, the summative task. And then both subjects have their disciplinary learning during the same time frame, during the same week or few weeks. They would each explore the unit's statement of inquiry through the lens of their own subject or discipline. And then they again would share class time to bring their perspectives together and develop the integrated summative task. This is how a concurrent interdisciplinary unit would be organized, or it could be. It's one format. There might be some variations with the integrated learning interspersed with the disciplinary learning, but this is the basic framework. Some of the benefits, so just try to envision that happening in your school. Some of the benefits of this concurrent format are that students can compare and contrast the contributions of both subjects. I'll just say both, but there might be more than two. Both subjects as they are experiencing them at the same time. Say that a specific inquiry question is explored in one of the subjects, and then around the same time frame, it doesn't have to be exactly on the same day or anything. Around the same time frame, the other subject is also exploring that question from their perspective. So students can compare and contrast in real time almost, and it gives them a better idea of the strengths and limitations of each subject group. Also, another benefit is that teachers can collaborate on an ongoing basis and adapt the unit or the schedule as needed. So those are some benefits of concurrent learning and teaching. However, in some cases, an amazing IDU is envisioned, but due to scheduling constraints or the learning sequence, the sequencing of learning in the two different courses don't line up. So in these cases, there might be an introduction to the interdisciplinary unit, hopefully involving both subjects just for a brief period, but it might be introduced by just one of the courses if, and this is a big if, that teacher has a very clear understanding of the contributions of the other subject. Then the subject who's able to fit it into their schedule first would have its disciplinary learning, while the other subject is involved in some other unit that's not related to the IDU. Then both subjects might have their own one or more separate units unrelated to the IDU. And then the second subject might have their disciplinary learning that supports the integrated purpose. Finally, one or both subjects would use class time to bring the learning from both subjects together and develop the integrated summative task. So just take a moment in your mind to consider the concurrent versus the non-concurrent. In the non-concurrent, what challenges might that type of structure pose for the teachers? And what challenges for the students? So here are just a few of the challenges. See if these align with what popped into your mind. Non-concurrent IDUs require the teachers involved to have more complete and shared understanding of what the other subject is also contributing, because they're going to need to keep referring to the other subject while they are helping them understand the differences and similarities. Also, there might be less ability to adapt the schedule and the learning experiences as student needs arise. Maybe they're not getting something and they need to shift around how the unit's progressing. But if one subject's already done with their teaching, it kind of leaves the teacher who comes second with a little bit more challenge. Potential challenge for students. So this is sometimes a challenge even when in concurrent teaching and learning. However, with non-concurrent, because time is fast between the disciplinary learning, students might have a more difficult time comparing the benefits and limitations of each subject and synthesizing that knowledge. Non-concurrent IDUs can be done and they can be effective, but they need really, really clear planning and extensive collaboration between the teachers involved. Now, let's look at the change that will necessitate revising all of the current IDUs and, of course, will impact the development of future IDUs. The interdisciplinary objectives and their associated criteria have been revised. Main difference you'll see right off, there are now 3 objectives criteria instead of 4. Another thing you'll notice is that communication, the current objective C that was removed, is now emphasized in all 3 revised objectives. So just to remind ourselves, these are the current objectives. Let's take a glance over, refresh your memory. Yeah, we had disciplinary grounding, and then synthesizing, and then communicating, and then reflection. Okay, so here are the changes. We can see that some of the words have been completely eliminated, but the essence of most of the current objectives have been retained. In this slide, the dark blue words are still explicitly part of the new objectives. The light blue words are not included exactly, but their intention is still included. And all of the other words that have been changed. So you can see that objective C, communicating, has been deleted entirely. Here are the revised objectives. The words in blue carry over from the current objectives, and the changed parts of the objectives are shown in red. Clearly, all of the command terms have been changed, changing the focus of the descriptors. And in a bit, we'll also take a look at how these changes will also necessitate changes in the nature of the summative tasks and the learning experiences. So we'll look at each of these in more depth. But first, take a moment to look more closely at where the deleted objective, communicating, is now assessed. We can see that in objective B, the product needs to communicate something. And we can see that students will need to communicate their thinking in order to demonstrate their achievement in all of the other objectives. So that changes the nature of the task a lot. So what will the changes in the objectives impact? Clearly, the design of the integrated task. How will students demonstrate these objectives? Yeah, analyzing, evaluating, creating a product, justifying, discussing. So teachers will need to consider questions like, how many distinct tasks might be needed in order to demonstrate these objectives? Which objectives might be grouped in the same task, and which need to be separate tasks? And what order might the tasks need to be completed? Do they need to analyze their disciplinary knowledge before they evaluate the interdisciplinary perspective? So to think through those questions, let's really look at the command terms. Take a moment to refresh your memory of the definitions. consider what forms of evidence could students provide in order to demonstrate each of these command terms. There are some examples provided in the new guide on page 34. And they suggest for the command terms, analyze, evaluate, justify, and discuss, that would be the students communicating their thinking. They could do a commentary, a presentation, a process journal, a visual organizer, a blog, a personal learning log, shared digital notes, scripts, cartoons, although they suggest cartoons, but I really can't imagine a cartoon that would have the depth of thinking that would be required. But maybe. Then for the other objective or criterion, create a product that communicates interdisciplinary understanding. The product or outcomes that they suggest are a website, an essay, an artistic performance, an experiment, an investigation, an oral presentation, infographics, and I added on a services as action product or outcome. Yeah, I could combine service and action really well in an IDU and have that be their product. When the objectives change, obviously the assessment criteria that align with those objectives change as well. So the criteria rubrics and the assessment of the integrated task are impacted. So here are some general assessment notes. The integrated task in an IDU is assessed only with ID interdisciplinary criteria, unlike the current ones, which criterion A, you were informed by your subject group criteria. Only ID criteria, assess the ID task per task. And we'll look at assessment of disciplinary learning a bit more when we go through the clarifications that are in the new guide. Second thing, teachers work collaboratively to assess student achievement in all of the ID criteria. Criterion A is no longer about demonstrating disciplinary knowledge. So those subject group criteria don't really apply anymore. The IDU teachers are considering the degree to which the students analyze the disciplinary knowledge that contributes to the integrated purpose of the unit. The analysis itself is not assessed with disciplinary criteria. If there's a difference in the degree to which a student analyzes the knowledge from each discipline or subject, the teachers will still need to collaboratively determine the best fit level, right? They might do an excellent analysis of the sciences knowledge and not so great of the mathematics knowledge. Let's just pretend. Yeah, so the teachers will need to, of course, provide formative support to make that mathematics analysis more robust. But in the end, if there's a difference, the teachers will need to figure out a best fit level of the analysis itself. Teachers may optionally choose to assess the subject-specific summative tasks. During the disciplinary part of the learning process, you can now have, or it's encouraged to have, subject-specific summative tasks, like a mini summative, a mini project. And those are assessed with subject-specific criteria. Those achievement levels in those subject-specific tasks do not inform the ID achievement levels. That's a change because we're analyzing. We're not just demonstrating knowledge anymore. Okay, so while students' level of understanding of disciplinary knowledge will have an impact on their ability to analyze that knowledge in ID criterion A1, AI, the analysis involves a separate achievement level. We'll look a bit more at the assessment of disciplinary learning when we go through the clarifications. But basically, that's the difference now between assessing the ID criteria no longer being informed by the subject-specific criteria. Okay, so now we're going to look at each new criterion individually, starting with criterion A. Take a look. What do you notice about these command terms in criterion A? I'll just say A1. Do you notice anything odd about them? There are what appear to be two command terms in each descriptor. Analyze by identifying, analyze by outlining, analyze by describing, analyze by explaining. Let's try to break that down. It's important to remember that the command term in criterion A1 is analyze. That's the command term. The bold terms, attempts to, partially, fully, identify, outline, describe, explaining, those are level differentiators. They are the depth, thoroughness, and specificity of the student's analysis. So always remember the command term is analyze, and those other words are just helping you determine the depth, thoroughness, and specific details in the analysis. Okay, so what is it that students are analyzing? They're analyzing each subject's contribution to the unit's integrated purpose and product. So if the student needs additional clarification of the differentiator terms, those identify, outline, describe, explain, that can be included as part of the task-specific clarifications. The underlined phrases in this example can be made unit and task specific. So if the student doesn't quite understand identify, you might replace it with state, because that's part of the definition of identify. Okay, if they don't understand outlining, well, in the definition, summarizing, it's more thorough than stating, is part of it. Keep in mind, if they already understand these words, identify, outline, describe, explain, no need to replace them in the task-specific clarifications. But if they need a little more guidance, or you do when you're assessing it, the task, you can use some of those definitions in there. The part that says the unit's integrated purpose and product, that would be replaced by the whatever's happening in the unit. Yeah, you'd make that task specific. Okay, moving on, criterion A2, what do you notice again? Again, there appear to be two command terms in the descriptors. In this criterion strand, the command term is evaluate, to make an appraisal by weighing the strengths and limitations. So remember, we were talking about strengths and limitations, and students need to be able to be supported in understanding what does that mean? What is the strengths of what science is contributing? What is the strength of what mathematics is contributing to this final outcome? So they need to be supported in understanding those. So if it was me, I would put strengths and limitations right into the task-specific rubric. That's part of the definition of evaluate. Again, those bold terms in this particular, they haven't put the bolding yet in the new guide. I think that's going to be one of the changes. They're going to make the level differentiators bold, but I can show you here. The bold words are the level differentiators in the depth and specificity of students' evaluation. So evaluate is the command term. Those others are just levels of depth and specific details. Again, if students need additional clarification of the differentiator terms, the definitions could be included as a part of the task-specific clarifications. Criterion B. In this criterion strand, the command term is create. So that means they have to evolve something out of their own thought process, Can't be like, a test. They're creating a product or an outcome, even though it says product, it's clarified in the guide that it could be an outcome, an action. So again, note that the bold terms differentiate the levels. Selects, applies, develops, synthesizes, all refer to the level at which students have used the disciplinary knowledge from both subjects in their product or outcome. The other bold terms, in an attempt, some, partially, effectively, purposeful, those all refer to the quality of the communication of the student's interdisciplinary understanding. Does this product communicate, bring together, and share interdisciplinary understanding? Well, they try to, they do some, they partially do it, or they effectively and purposefully do it. Clarifies the levels. Okay, so if, again, students need additional support for the differentiator terms, the definitions provided in the guides could be included. In this case, the underlying word or phrase can be made unit or task specific. You're going to say what the subjects or disciplines are, right? You'll replace that. There's more clues within the guide about what that product or outcome is. And some of the questions they ask are, can it create a real world impact? Does it address a real world issue? Does it connect with and influence a real world audience? Does the task allow students to be agents of change in creating a more sustainable, interconnected, and peaceful world? What real world issue will this unit address, and what product will students create? Purposeful action comes out of it. Okay, so that was the criterion B1. So B2, in this criterion strand, the command term that to emphasize is justify. This is an odd one. Because justify only shows up in the 7-8 level. But they are trying to justify how their product communicates. Those other command terms, state, outline, describe, those indicate the depth, thoroughness, and specificity which with the student tries to justify, right? With they provide reasons or evidence for how their product communicates interdisciplinary understanding. So if the students need additional support for the differentiator terms, the definitions, again, could be included. And the word product or outcome could be made unit and task specific in the clarifications. Criterion C, in this criterion strand, the command term is discuss. Even though, once again, it only appears in the 7-8 level. They are trying to discuss, offer a considered, balanced review, including a range of arguments, opinions, conclusions. Yeah, they are trying to discuss in this criterion. It is differentiated at each achievement level to distinguish how detailed and thorough the discussion is. So students might also need to be reminded of the meaning of the term development in these descriptors. They'll need to keep track of somehow how their understanding changes and or develops over time, over the unit, so they can discuss it in detail. We'll get into an idea for helping them keep track of their understanding in a bit. Okay, so criterion C1, again, if they need additional support, the definitions can be included. For instance, discusses, you could put give valid reasons or evidence. For describe, you could say give a detailed account, right? You can use those to provide more clarity. Again, in criterion C2, the command term is discuss, once again, even though you only see it at the 7-8 level. Same thing as the C1. Those other terms, states, outlines, describes, those are distinguishes between the detail and thoroughness of the discussion. Okay, and here's an idea for clarifying those differentiator terms if you need it, if they need it, or you need it as assessing. The word future in the 1-2 level, that seems to be an error because they have taken it out of all the other levels. In the guide, they clarify that action means potential future action or action taken during the unit. Either one, it doesn't have to be future. So if you're using your IDU as your services action, if you're running service and action through this one, they will maybe have already taken action during the unit, and they can give valid reasons and evidence for how their interdisciplinary understanding enabled that action. So it's within the unit or future. That's clarified in the guide. Okay, one more assessment change to note. It's the same criteria descriptors are used across MYP 1 through 5. You know how in most things they offer an MYP 1, MYP 3, and MYP 5 criteria? In this, there's just one. It's used across all levels, and the differentiating between the levels is through increasingly complex contexts. Maybe in MYP 1, it's something, the action and the product or the discussion has to do with something very familiar, and in a later year level the context is more unfamiliar. But the differentiation happens of the task in the context and the tasks themselves. Simpler tasks earlier, more complex tasks later. Same criteria descriptors, same rubrics used throughout. What else will these changes in the objectives criteria impact? Clearly, the design of the learning process. So just as in all units, teachers will need to pre-plan how students develop their ability to address the objectives, especially the formative feedback and formative tasks will need to change to support the new summative. So during the learning process, students will need opportunities to practice, receive feedback, and support on their progress in these objectives and their higher order thinking. So that's going to involve a different type of learning experience than maybe is currently in your IDUs. How will they be supported in developing their analysis, evaluation, justification, and discussion skills? And just as in all units, teachers will need to consider which ATL skills and strategies are needed. And at a minimum, it's clear higher order critical and creative thinking skills will be needed in order to support the analyze, evaluate, create, justify, and discuss, and communication skills. Being part of all of the objectives and criteria, communicating what you're thinking and helping your product or outcome communicate interdisciplinary learning, all going to be important. So at a minimum, you're probably going to have some critical thinking and communication skills chosen for ATL skills. So how will students keep track of their learning and thinking? Well, we talked about this a little bit, but even in a concurrently taught IDU, how are we going to help students keep track of their learning and thinking? This is what has to happen. It should happen in current IDUs as well, but it's even more critical with the new objectives and criteria because analysis, evaluation, justification, and discussion require a deepening reflection process over time, particularly in that one criteria that was about development. So you got to keep track of what was it to begin with, and then how did my understanding develop over time. So one idea, it doesn't have to be a written journal, it could be any type of process journal, but one idea is to use an IDU process journal. And this is really tiny print, so you don't need to look at it closely. I'm going to share with you a Google folder, and it's going to have all of these. It's going to have many things, but one of the things will be all of these reflection prompts. And you can use these types of questions in discussions or in a writing or in a blog post or however you're having your students keep track of their thinking and their learning. These questions might be, they're not defined by IB, I just thought of them, but they might be excellent types of questions to help students consider each of the objectives and be able to include those in whatever the summative tasks are related to the associated criterion. I'm not going to read through them. Here's the objective B, the synthesis. So here's some questions that they might want to consider. when they're thinking about their product or outcome, and then when they're justifying that their product or outcome actually does communicate interdisciplinary understanding. And here's some reflection prompts for Objective C. Okay, so just some additional changes. Some parts have been consolidated and some parts have been deleted. You'll notice that 20 pages is a lot. Many sections were deleted. The guide was shortened. Note, and one thing in particular is that the forms of integration are no longer part of the guide. If forms of integration from the old guide help you think about ideas for ways to combine subjects, fine. But because the objectives have changed, you might not find them as helpful, because there has to be this product or outcome. It has to be this meaningful, real world influence of the outcome. So no need to try to figure out forms of integration anymore. There's also a lot more clarification and guidance added throughout, through explanations and examples. One of the things that's clarified is the summative assessment of disciplinary learning. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but just to make sure that the points are made, we'll go over them again. There needs to be substantive knowledge, concepts, and skills from each participating subject discipline, part of the IDU. I can't tell you how many IDUs we see in BQC that it's minimal contributions from one or more of the subjects involved. It needs to be substantive, like you would teach this in an actual single subject unit. You would teach this knowledge. In order to be able to analyze their disciplinary knowledge, they need to have a clear understanding of that knowledge. Disciplinary grounding can be formatively and summatively assessed during the disciplinary learning process and entered as achievement levels in subject grade books. Sometimes people worry, oh, I don't want to waste my IDU time. I really need another criterion A, so I can't be in an IDU. Well, yes, you can, because you can have a subject-specific task and use subject-specific criteria to assess them. That can go in your subject gradebook. However, just to repeat, those achievement levels are not used to inform the achievement level in the interdisciplinary criteria. The purpose of integration is clarified. I've gone over this before, but for those of you who haven't seen it, it's outlined and described in more clarity in the new guide. Okay, so let's think about this quote from the guide. Interdisciplinarity almost always involves some notion of utility, a need to identify a reason for seeking a synthesis. And that reason should not be, oh, because I want to be compliant and do my mandatory one IDU. There should be a real reason for having an IDU. So when considering the purpose of integrating subjects, it's helpful to remember 2 points from this quote. The nature of the product needs to be useful. And we need to clearly identify a purposeful reason for seeking a synthesis, for bringing these subjects or disciplines together. Elsewhere in the guide, it says that especially in later years of the MYP, ID summative tasks should allow students to be agents of change in creating a more sustainable, interconnected, and peaceful world. In other words, using the IDU to bring the IB mission to life. Substantive, real reason for bringing them together. So there's 3 elements to clarify in the purpose of integration. First, it's helpful to describe the disciplinary content and perspective that each subject will contribute to the interdisciplinary purpose. What content and conceptual perspective will subject 1 contribute? And what content and conceptual purpose will subject 2 contribute? Then a description of the synthesis is also needed. How will students synthesize the disciplinary perspectives, and what product will they create that communicates interdisciplinary understanding? In the unit plan, it might look something like this, and they have examples in the guide as well and in the TSM example unit. In subject 1, students will explore the content and conceptual perspective of that subject. Same in subject 2, and however many subjects there are. And then during the interdisciplinary learning process, students will synthesize their learning in both subjects by doing this and developing this. It might look something like that. So this is really tiny writing again, and I'm this unit plan is life satisfaction measurable. That is in the TSM on the Program Resource Center, but I also am including this unit in your folder, your Google Doc folder that I would share on the IBMA website. So here's an example, but you can read through it on your own. But the basic structure is describing the disciplinary contributions to the integrated purpose and then the synthesis. So let's just look at how they have included the concepts and the global context exploration. This helps the teacher really think through how are we going to have two different perspectives on these concepts, and how are we going to use the global context exploration as the context for the whole unit in our disciplinary and our interdisciplinary learning. I love this process of creating the purpose of integration because it creates the framework for the entire unit. It creates such clarity if you can write a good one. So let's just look at what's included. You can see that the unit's key concept, communication, is included in the both subjects, in the disciplinary contributions and in the synthesis. The related concepts, audience imperatives and perspectives, are also noted, although the wording has changed a bit. And the global context exploration, influences on happiness and life satisfaction. That's the exploration from the global context, identities and relationships. They've also tried to weave that in so that they are sure that they're using that context for their inquiries. In this particular example, they also included some of the subject-specific related concepts. From language and literature, they included point of view and purpose, and from mathematics, they included representation and patterns. So those were not related concepts that both subjects were going to explore. They were just going to strengthen the disciplinary grounding. But they found a way to think about how they were going to bring them into the unit, and they described it here. Okay, the statement of inquiry has also been clarified. These should look familiar to you, but doesn't hurt to hear them again. So there's quickly, there are 3 main points to remember. It includes a transferable conceptual understanding that describes a meaningful relationship between at least 2 concepts. It explicitly refers to the unit's global context exploration, and it explores transferable ideas developed across a range of facts and topics. So what does each of those mean? First, it should be transferable. What does that mean? The statement of inquiry needs to be equally relevant to and explorable by all the subjects, disciplines participating in the IDU. It does not necessarily need to be transferable to all 8 MYP subject groups, but it needs to be transferable and important within the subject groups that are participating. In addition to being transferable, it needs to express a conceptual understanding that describes a meaningful relationship between at least 2 concepts, one of which must be a key concept. There's a number of combinations that could take. It could be a relationship between 2 key concepts, a relationship between a key concept and a related concept that are equally relevant to both or all participating subjects. It could be a key concept and 2 related concepts, or 2 key concepts and a related concept, any combination. Just one of them needs to be a key concept. Another part of that first requirement is that it's meaningful. What does meaningful mean? This might not have to do with meaningful, but we see so many statements of inquiry that end up being a paragraph, a question, a bunch of phrases. So it needs to be a sentence. It's a declarative sentence. The sentence needs to make sense. Don't get hung up by, oh, the key concept plus related concept plus global context exploration equals statement of inquiry. Don't get hung up by that formula. It needs to make sense. So keep editing, revising over and over. Sometimes I rewrite my statements of inquiry throughout my entire unit plan because I keep thinking about it. So it might take many, many drafts and remember that if using the concept words like in that mechanical way creates an awkward sentence that's hard to understand, remember that the key and related concept words can be replaced by clearly representative words or phrases. For example, well, a good place to maybe find those replacement words is to look at the definitions of the concepts in the MYP guides. So for instance, communication might be replaced by writing or speaking. Change might be replaced by transformation. Relationships might be replaced by interconnections. Narrative by story or storyline. You can make it understandable and fluent. And it's really helpful up in the top part of your unit plan. If you do replace the actual word of a key or related concept, put in parentheses what you're replacing it with so that you can remember, for one thing, but also when you're presenting to students, you can say, oh, when we're looking at stories, we're thinking about the idea of narrative. So that developing deeper and broader understanding of the concept still continues, even though those words aren't maybe being used exactly. Okay, the idea expressed needs to be important. It needs to be relevant and transferable to both or all participating disciplines or subject groups. It needs to be an enduring conceptual idea about the world. And in some units, it could be an idea that's foundational and explorable to many or all subjects. So an enduring conceptual idea is saying something important about how we perceive the world, understand or organize our world, how we communicate about our world, how we interact in our world. These are like foundational ideas that really working them through and wrestling with them gives students insights into how the world works. So the idea needs to be important. Okay, the second characteristic is that it should explicitly refer to the unit's global context exploration. This is a current expectation also, and now it's clearly included in the guide. It means that there will be an identifiable conceptual understanding in the statement of inquiry, and there will be a recognizable global context exploration. And it really helps to think about the statement of inquiry in terms of those two distinct elements. There's a conceptual understanding, and there's the global context exploration through which that idea and the unit content are explored throughout the unit. That's why it's called the exploration. Those things are explored through that context. So let's remember some things about the global context exploration. It represents a real world setting, event, circumstance, application. There's not really a good word because context is the best word for it, but it's how students will explore the unit's conceptual understanding and the unit content. Important to remember, you can customize the global context exploration. That's what makes explicit reference to it in the statement of inquiry possible. If you were limited only to those lists of explorations in MYP from principles to practice, it might result in a very awkward statement of inquiry. You can customize your exploration as long as it aligns with the intentions of the global context. So let's just look at that. We've all seen awkward, fairly meaningless SOIs that try to include the exact examples in principles into practice. But remember, again, says examples right at the top, examples. They are possible explorations to develop. They are not exhaustive and they are not required that you choose from those. So you could pick one word from a list. You could pick two words from the same list. You could pick words from different lists. And sometimes when you're not quite sure how to describe it, you know, sometimes circling or going through and just saying, well, it's kind of related to this and just noting them helps you get started. So, but sometimes those exact words maybe don't clearly express the context for your unit, or those words sound awkward. So you can customize it. So let's just look at this example from identities and relationships. Let's just say that throughout a unit, the context is something about ingrained societal roles. Maybe it's a language acquisition or an individuals in society's unit, and they're looking at how societal roles impact something. So it's sort of related to roles and role models, and it's sort of related to social development, but that doesn't really describe it. So a customized exploration that might be developed might be social norms, right? That might fit nicely into a statement of inquiry and really describes what the context of inquiry is. So there are those two characteristics. And then the third characteristic is that it needs to explore transferable ideas developed across a range of facts and topics, meaning that the statement of inquiry needs to be fully explorable through the content from both or all of the participating subjects. If any part of the statement of inquiry is only relevant to the content of one of the subjects, the statement of inquiry needs to be revised. If you stuck a word from mathematics like quantities or something in there and language and literature can't really explore that very well, then that concept needs to go down into the learning, into the subject-specific learning part of the unit and taken out of the statement of inquiry. The whole statement of inquiry needs to be explorable through content in both or all participating subjects. And then we're going to get into inquiry questions. This is clarified clearly in the guide, in the new guide. Wasn't so clear in the old guide. So the inquiry questions identified in the inquiry section of the unit plan should be relevant to and explorable by both or all subjects. Again, if it's only explorable by one of the subjects, take it out of that section and put it down in the learning process of that subject. Inquiry questions should be drawn from and inspired by the statement of inquiry. What does that mean? It means that the questions should reference one or more of the unit's concepts and or the context exploration. Those should be in there. Those questions are going to help students consider the unit's concepts and context and the relationship between them from the distinct perspectives of the participating subjects and disciplines. Now, another thing that seems like it should be self-evident, but for some reason it isn't. So I want to really emphasize this. Those inquiry questions that you list in the top of your planner should actually be used during the unit as prompts for inquiry-based learning experiences. So you're going to see those questions again down in the description of the learning process. How are you going to use them to guide actual inquiries? Side note, questions that refer to specific unit content or are only explorable by one subject can be included in the description of the learning process in the relevant subject. So move those questions out of the inquiry section of your planner and move those down to the learning process of the subject they pertain to. There have been some additions to the guide. There are links to two example unit planner formats, and I'm also going to include a Google Doc for you in that folder that I'm going to share. There are exemplar unit plans referenced in the PRC and TSM. There's at least 3 new ones that have been added that demonstrate the sharing level, but at least the using level. There are expanded appendices included in the new guide so that people don't have to be running back and forth between different publications. There's definitions of all the key and all subjects related concepts. There are global context and example explorations in there. All of the ATL skills are in there. The evaluating MYP interdisciplinary unit plans, descriptors and rubric are in there. They're all in there in one guide, and it's 20 pages shorter. So you can tell they deleted a lot because they added a lot. There's also, and we're not going to get into this because it's a whole nother topic, but there's an example of using IDUs to strengthen a school's area of program development. What is that? An area of program development is a new component of the school action planning, and it's submitted as part of your school evaluation. So we're not going to get into that, but the example is using an IDU to strengthen students' social and emotional well-being. I'm also going to share with you an example of using IDUs to strengthen services action. Okay, so those will be in your resource folder. But let's get real, because that's a lot, isn't it? So first of all, breathe. These changes will impact quite a bit of how your current IDUs are planned, implemented, and assessed. And that can feel like a lot of pressure, just what you don't need right now. So we need to stay calm. We need to have realistic expectations, and your circumstances at your school will dictate how quickly or how easily you are able to make these changes. If your school, for instance, is able to give teachers release time or paid planning time over the summer, more IDUs might be revised by the start of the school in the fall. But if your school is not able to provide those types of support and stress levels from all the changes we have all been through remains high, focus on revising any existing IDUs one at a time. Consider implementing them as is. Hopefully it's still a great interdisciplinary connection, but assess the tasks only with subject-specific criteria. Don't use the IDU criteria. You can still keep the plans and have nice interdisciplinary connections, but just don't use the new criteria while you're in this holding pattern. But IB is not saying this, I'm saying this as a get real thing. You're not going to get dinged in your evaluation visit because you're doing your best. If you have an evaluation visit in the near future, just write it in your plan, your action plan, your plan for revising all your IDUs over time, and set a priority of making and documenting more of your interdisciplinary connections between subjects. It's still valuable interdisciplinary learning, and it's valued by the IB, those connections, even if it's not a formal IDU. Okay, so it may take some time to revise those formal IDUs. Just want you to take a breath and like ease the stress of all this information for just a sec, okay? Questions. I did want to get to the questions that were submitted. There were only 2. So, oops, kind of big, but I can't really get it all in, but let's see. So I think that we answered the first question. What can be assessed by single subjects alone and what must be assessed by the subjects in collaboration? Yeah, I clarified that. You're using the ID criteria only to assess the ID task. Yeah? Okay, yeah. The second question was a little, I mean, we face so many challenges, especially public schools, but the question was, where are schools supposed to record the student achievement in the integrated summative task? Now, there's so few of them in most schools. Where do you do that? All that the published guidance says, it's very general. It says that, this is in the new guide, schools must report student achievement in the interdisciplinary learning to students and parents. Yeah, that's it. That's the requirement. But on page 40, it also lists many different ways that a school might consider meeting that requirement. They might have a separate individual report on interdisciplinary learning. They might have a section of, if they have flexibility in their report card, they might have a section that contains achievement levels for each criterion in the IDUs. They might have just at the end of the year, one summative report that contains the cumulative best fit overall judgment about the student's achievement in interdisciplinary learning. They might just communicate it in a letter to parents and students. They might have a conversation in student conferences, right? So it just has to be reported. It doesn't need to necessarily be on your report card. It just needs to be shared. So they offer you lots and lots of options. So it really depends on how prescriptive your report card is, how flexible your school's report card, how could you use it or not use it. Okay.
Donna has a question, Diane.
Okay.
Donna?
Are you gonna,
Yeah, so I wanted to ask mine out loud just because it's too much to type, and it may be something that if anybody else has a shorter question, I'd be happy to wait till the end. But if you could go back to your slide that was right before the statement of inquiry, the one that says TSM example is life satisfaction measurable. It says
yeah.
LS mathematics. So you went through 3 different slides and you highlighted in different colors 3 different parts of that that were reflected in that example. Could you, I know you're going to provide us this presentation. That's the only place, I mean, this is a lot of information, but that's the one place where I kind of got lost, but I felt like that was a really key component to understand, is how they integrated 3 different things. And I wasn't sure exactly, it was too fast for me to really recall what you said each of those 3 parts were. So is there any way to, like with your 3 different colors of highlighting, to on the slide that you're sharing with us, like at the top of it, say like the pink is the whatever context, or the green is the key, whatever.
I will.
Do you know,
and you know what?
does that make sense?
What I will. It does totally make sense. And also you can just find that, I'm gonna stop sharing because you can also find that that whole unit planner is life satisfaction measurable. It's on the Program Resource Center under Teacher Support Materials, Interdisciplinary Teaching and Learning. But I'm also including it in the folder that you're going to be shared through IBMA. But what I'll do is when I share the slides, I will include speaker notes that clarifies anything that I've said that is not in the slide.
Okay,
that help?
That would be helpful. Yeah, so just for those 3 parts, I felt like that was really useful, but I didn't catch it enough to like grab onto it because it wasn't written. But thank you.
The colors, just for you to know too, that in the example planner that is shared on the Program Resource Center, and the same one that's shared in the resource folder that I'm going to share with you, the colors are in there. It is color coded. So
but does it say what the colors? Does it say what the colors represent?
It's color coded throughout the unit plan. So in the part where it identifies the key concept, the related concepts, etc., you'll see those same colors. So you'll be able to cross-reference where those are.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other?
Where will we access what you're giving us?
So Donna and everybody, this will be under IBMA, networking, MYP, IDU, what did we call it? IDU revisions.
IDU guide revisions or something.
And then on the right column, instead of saying now registration, it will say resources and recording. You click there and you will get everything. But please give us at least a week so that we can have enough time to put the resources together and then for John to upload.
Yeah, I'm still working on that a bit too.
And so anybody that goes there could access that, or do we have to have a special code since we attended?
No, you can go there and access it. It's open access. One question, Diane, that was repeated is are we understanding that every time there is an IDU unit taught, all 3 criteria need to be assessed, whether we're assessing 6th graders, year 1, or 8th graders, year 3, or is it developmental? Like we can be easier with the 6th graders, but include more with the 7th graders and all 3 with the 8th graders.
Yeah, that's I wish I had the exact page number, but that's clarified in the guide that you don't need to assess all of them, but they all strands need to be assessed during the year. So if you have multiple IDUs, especially in a lower grade and a lower level, you might choose. I really tried to look at it and see which ones would I leave out, and that was hard. But they are meant to work together. So you're working towards having the IDUs assess all strands of all 3 criteria in the IDU. However, when students are MYP1, even MYP2, they're just learning about these things. There may be instances where you don't choose all the strands, but I would imagine you would at least do all the criteria.
Okay, I get it. Another question related to that, is the understanding that whatever the integrated assessment is or product will have enough, whether the students will be answering all the criteria with one product, or should the teacher create a reflection for C?
You know, when we were writing the units, we made multiple tasks. Yeah, the
Okay.
product was one thing, and then all of those reflection-y sort of analysis, evaluation, discussion tasks, we maybe even divided those up into different tasks.
Okay.
So I don't see how the product, criterion B1, I don't see how you couldn't have at least two products, one with all the writing or reflection and one the product. So I would think you would have at least two tasks.
Okay. Okay. Those are all the questions that I saw.
One last question for you, which is, can you just talk just a few words about the separation when there's one subject being taught in one subject area and one subject being taught in the other subject area? What is it that those makes the interdisciplinary? What makes it truly interdisciplinary learning experiences separate from the other learning experiences?
Okay, so let's just say I don't think this is a good idea. It's just what popped into my mind, but I see it a lot, and so I'll just use it as an example. Let's just say it's PHE in math. A lot of times the PHE teacher will have students create data about their achievement in something, you know, running, weightlifting, something. Yeah, and then they will, the math people will be doing data analysis, creating tables, figuring out, you know, that's their side. So then they would each be learning those separate. Yeah, the PE would just be weightlifting and recording their scores. Math would be learning about all that. And then they would do interdisciplinary. They would bring it together and they would input the PHE data into whatever formulas and tables, and they would do an analysis of it. And then they would come to the conclusion about what would they need to improve in order to improve this line, or, you know, slope line or something like that. So you're bringing them together and you're saying, you know, how does this help athletes? And how does using mathematics help athletes? And how does mathematics use data to interpret the world, right? So you would be, I mean, that's like I said, it's not a great example of an IDU, but I see it so much. But it's when they would bring it together and be analyzing and using the skills from both, or the information from both together. That makes sense?
It does. It does. Thank you. And thank you so much. This was a wonderful presentation. There's a lot to take away.
I hope it wasn't too much. Yeah.
It was great. Thank you so much, Diane. And thank you everybody for attending and staying with us another half hour plus.
Yeah, you're welcome. I wanted to get through it because it's important, and you are all welcome. Thank you for all your appreciations. And yes, Jean, breathe, breathe, breathe. Things will fall into place. All right.
Excellent.
So thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody. Enjoy your break. I know everybody's going to have some type of break next week. Enjoy. Yes. Well deserved.
Awesome. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Okay.